The late New York Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan once said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not entitled to your own facts." Well, times have changed, and now everyone, it seems, is entitled to their own facts. And they receive plenty of affirmation of those facts in their own social media silos. In November 2015, before the term fake news really started gaining cachet, the then candidate Donald Trump tweeted out this whopper. How many people saw this on their Facebook feeds? Now, this was pretty easy to debunk. One, because most people are killed by somebody they know. So the notion that 87% of white people or 81% of white people were killed by a black person was obviously false. And then, more importantly, there was no such thing as a Crime Statistics Bureau, San Francisco. But this thing spread like wildfire, and it got, it was pretty quickly debunked. But I have so many people, I like keeping people, I have a lot of friends from college and stuff who have veered far to the right and veered far to the left, and it's great keeping them in your Facebook feeds. And I recommend everybody do that. Even if there's somebody who's not a friend, but is out in that far field from wherever you're at, friend them, and you get to see all this really interesting stuff that is alarming and troubling. BuzzFeed, right before the election, did this study on Facebook engagement for the top 20 election stories. And you can see that right as we approached election day, stories that were demonstrably false were actually getting more engagement than actual mainstream news, stuff coming from mainstream news sources. This was a really alarming study about the impact of fake news, but it was a quantitative study, not a qualitative study. So it wasn't something that, it raised a lot of alarm, but it's not something that was really that alarming, and here's why. About how many of those, I can imagine that I am probably a pretty fairly high up, included in that 8.7 million, as probably are a lot of you, because you saw these stories, you clicked on them, they were so outrageous that you clicked on them simply to debunk them or to see just how silly they were. And even when you looked at the mainstream stories that were counted in that group, here are the top 5 mainstream stories that had the most Facebook engagement leading up to the election. Well, you can see that 3 of the 5 were not, you can tell just by the titles, but I've actually gone in and looked at each of them, weren't news at all, they were commentary, including in the one about, the New York Post one about Melania Trump's girl-on-girl photos, which was actually the real news. So of those 5, 3 are commentary, and then one of the 2 news stories is girl-on-girl photos. So not surprising that it had such engagement. So the point is that before I get to that, there was a recent study by a doctoral candidate from Northwestern that found that online consumption of fake news was 10 times smaller than online consumption of real news. And that figure was probably considerably higher for the real news consumption, because in this study, he counted the Drudge Report as a fake news producer. The Drudge Report doesn't produce fake news. It is an aggregator of real news. And so, what you're seeing here is that in addition to that report, it found that people who visited the fake news sites then went immediately to a real news site. So what you're seeing here is the red bar is where they started a fake news site and where they went to next. So you'll see that almost so many people who went to a fake news site immediately went to a real news site, And in many instances, more went to real news sites or ended up consuming, the consumers of fake news ended up consuming oftentimes more real news than fake news. So my point here is that for all the worry and fuss about fake news, the real worry isn't fake news. That's been around as long as real news. The internet and social media have rapidly expanded its reach. But the fact is that it's pretty easy to debunk simply by looking at the URL often in many cases. The real worry is the delegitimization of real news as fake. Hyperpartisan media has been hard at work at this for some time. It went into overdrive with the launch of Fox News and the rise of celebrity commentators like Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter, and Sean Hannity. And now Donald Trump, from his perch atop the American presidency, is giving currency to all those suspicions that a very large segment of the population had about legitimate news sources, even if they're not really sure they believe him either. But let's step back for a second. In 1972, Gallup, the survey organization, began polling the public's trust in the media. That year, which was obviously a year of great polarization in the country, still because of the Vietnam War and Nixon and everything like that, 68% of the public polled said they had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media. The highest grade it received was 4 years later at 72%, 1977. That's the same year that All the President's Men came out, which obviously isn't a coincidence. I imagine if we dug up surveys going back even before that, we'd find those levels of trust to be even higher. We had Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, often cited as the most trusted man in America at the time. We also had great media victories, the Pentagon Papers, Seymour Hersh's expose of the My Lai massacre, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's reporting on Watergate, obviously. And we've had some media victories in recent years as well. And we're seeing a lot today with the really vigorous competition between the New York Times and the reinvigorated Washington Post. The Boston Globe's coverage of the sexual abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church is probably one of the seminal moments of modern journalism. But we've also had catastrophes. Judith Miller's coverage of weapons of mass destruction continues to have ramifications in the Middle East and in journalism, providing lessons about the sources we trust. This, no doubt, is the most disastrous example of fake news in modern memory. Not out of any intentional plot on her part, but because of the ever-present danger of being manipulated by an administration and by your sources. In the 20 years since that high point in '77, the apex of trust in media, trust has eroded 20 percentage points. From about 1997 to 2004, it hovered just over 50%. From 2005 to 2009, it starts falling more sharply, about 7 percentage points. Fox News was launched in 1996. Facebook formally opened to anyone over 13 in 2006. Both those helped channel assaults on mainstream media. But again, it's a slow and steady decline, one helped in a big way by the Great Recession in 2008, which sharply reduced staffing in newsrooms and created a great culling of newspapers in general. About 100 papers have folded since then. Almost every newspaper in the country is about half, well, to put it another way, there are about half as many working journalists today as there were and by working journalists, I mean I don't mean bloggers, in their pajamas in a basement. I mean, professional journalists. There are about half as many professional journalists today as there were in 2008. So the decline slows, hovering about between 40 and 43% until 2015, when it suddenly plummets again, hitting an all-time low of 32% by September of 2016, right before the election. And more recent polls, right after the election as well, not represented here, have it right about the same spot. The biggest drop-off among that grouping, by the way, is, let me go back for 1 second here. So what accounts for that 8 percentage point drop down to from 40 to 32% in 1 year? We've only seen one other decline like that, 10 points between 2003 and 2004. And that was also, you can see right there where it dropped from 54 to 44 back there. And that also happened to be during a very divisive election year, when between Bush and Kerry, in which the Iraq War and the ramifications of Judith Miller were still very much being debated, and our reasons for going to Iraq were very much at issue. Now, the biggest drop-off in this last year was among Republicans, who fell from 32% in 2015 to 14% in 2016. Democrats fell from 55% to 51%, and independents fell from 32% to 30%. And it's fairly understandable. Republicans believe that the media focused too negatively on Trump. In fact, a Harvard Kennedy School study that came out right after the election found that Trump received about, the coverage of Trump was about 87% negative. Does anybody here know what that same study found of the coverage of Clinton? Anybody want to guess, throw out a number? 87%. The difference is that you had one candidate who seemed really impervious to the negative coverage. In fact, it almost seemed to propel him. And in the process, normalized for many the delegitimization of the news media. Upon his election, everyone who believed the rhetoric on Fox, on AM radio talk shows, on InfoWars, and elsewhere now had a champion at the highest level of power. When Trump tells an outright fabrication, this is him, by the way, calling CNN, saying to CNN, "You're fake news." That was at that moment. When Trump tells an outright fabrication, it can be called out, but it takes resources. The New York Times now has 6 people devoted to the White House. That's more than they've ever had, including one reporter up at 6 a.m. every morning to monitor Trump's overnight tweets, and one up past midnight for the same reason. But how does the Times respond every time Trump tweets out the failing New York Times, or that the media is the enemy of the American people, or casts real stories as fake news? After a while, it gains currency. It reaffirms for that vast audience out there something they wanted to believe and now are hearing it from the top levels. Trump isn't alone among presidents who didn't get along with media. Nixon famously, of course. But going back even well beyond that, Thomas Jefferson once said, "As for what's not true, you'll always find an abundance in the newspapers." He also called newspapers a polluted vehicle. But few, if any, have ever been so personal and public in their attacks Now, I don't think Trump has an enemies list yet, like Nixon did, so we'll see where he goes with that. But for all of Jefferson's scorn for newspapers, and those were just among several derisive quotes from him, he also said of them, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter." I don't think Trump's going to embrace that notion. Trump's frequent tweeting of misinformation also serves a more insidious function, whether intended or not, of controlling the news cycle. Some are already calling him a master manipulator of the media. I don't think I go that far. But without doubt, his tweets distract from more substantive matters. And at the same time, they can't be ignored. People say, well, why don't you just ignore him and go on to the real news? They can't. This is a man with his finger on the nuclear football, the nuclear trigger. And in some ways, the tweets are, not in some ways, I mean, the tweets are fascinating. I mean, he's communicating, for all his faults and for what the tweets say, he's communicating with Americans in a way no president ever has. It's just fascinating to watch. Jelani Cobb of The New Yorker, in a speech earlier this year, compared Donald Trump and his rapid issuance of untruths and lies to Senator Joseph McCarthy. Cobb said at a recent conference at the Columbia School of Journalism that McCarthy set out to game objective reporting and use it to his advantage. His objective was to lie exponentially while reporters tried to fact-check arithmetically. Print newspapers at the time actually started fact-checking within the stories, which was something new, adding in parentheses after a McCarthy statement, "This is not true." The number of sources of information then that was, whether real or imagined, were limited. There were 3 networks. Most people got their news from the 3 networks. There were a lot more newspapers, of course, but the news was much more refined. That's not so today. Technology has torn down the price barriers to news distribution. Anyone with a laptop and a minimal understanding of WordPress can create their own site or spread the barest of falsehoods on Facebook or hyperpartisan sites. Unfortunately, the price barriers for news gathering has not gone down. Original reporting costs money, and fewer news outlets have the money to go out and do it right. The question for the media, especially for newspapers in their weakened state, is how do they break through that fog of hate, of misinformation and outright propaganda? And how do they break people out of their information silos? In some ways, the Trump presidency represents a great opportunity for the media. Many people who were on the sidelines, who had grown apathetic about the news media, are checking back in and realizing the importance of a professional media, even if they don't always agree with them. Subscriptions at the New York Times, ProPublica, and the Washington Post are all going up. And some other organizations are investing in real news are growing. So what are newspapers and the media doing to either combat or capitalize on this new reality? Some are launching media literacy campaigns, though much more needs to be done, especially in schools and colleges. A group called the News Media Alliance, which includes the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, has started a campaign that all news media can join to help spread the gospel of real news. News organizations are more clearly defining their mission to the public and their importance, as demonstrated by the Washington Post's new motto, which you can love or hate. Democracy dies in darkness. It's you almost want to create a film. It's very film noir, I think. The Times ran its "Truth is Hard" ad during the Oscars. Not exactly a hostile audience, kind of preaching to the gospel there, right? And these and some other news organizations, including those two, are really reinvesting in news gathering. And these are really welcome developments after the news industry wasted so many years, so many of the last 10 years, trying to figure out the internet and social media and focusing on clicks rather than content. Unfortunately, many are still obsessing with that. And perhaps most importantly, news organizations are far more cognizant of avoiding false balance and calling lies lies. After Trump's claim of underreported terrorist attacks, Scott Paley, the anchor of CBS News, said on his newscast, opening his newscast, "It's been a busy day for presidential statements divorced from reality." This is from a pretty centrist newscaster. On another broadcast on February 24th, reporting on a skirmish between the media and Trump, Paley said, "The president's real troubles today were not with the media, but with the facts." For all that, though, it's clear that there's a segment of the population, a very big one, that will only be reached by selective media. Breitbart, the Daily Caller, or as Texas Congressman Lamar Smith suggested, from Trump himself. Better to get your news directly from the president. In fact, it might be the only way to get the unvarnished truth. As a final slide here, I'll end with one of Mark Twain's more famous quotes. If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. Well, interestingly enough, it's fake news. It's commonly attributed to him. We don't really know who said it. It wasn't Mark Twain. So with that, if there's questions.